Good evening, Mr. Keys. My research presentation will cover the Watts Riots, an African American rebellion that takes place in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. We'll begin with a quick introduction. The Watts Riots, also known as the Watts Rebellion or Black Urban Riots, took place for about 6 days between August 11th, 1965 through August 16th, 1965, resulting in around 3,500 arrests, 34 deaths, 1,032 injuries, and an insane $40 million in damages. Now I know what you're wondering, what could cause such enormous and long-lasting riots? But before we get to that, let me provide you with some background context. At this time, Los Angeles was geographically separated by ethnicities. Racism was thriving during this time period, and the African American community was being treated very poorly. Due to discrimination, Los Angeles African American residents were excluded from high-paying jobs, affordable housing, and even politics. Even worse, they faced discrimination by the Los Angeles Police Department, or LAPD, which is predominantly filled with white people. Living through these injustices had the community of Watts tired, and on the day of August 11th, 1965, in what seemed to be a normal traffic stop, turned out to result in what is now known as the Watts Riots. On that Wednesday evening on August 11th, a 21-year-old African American man named Marquette Fry is pulled over by Highway Patrol for allegedly driving too recklessly. After sobriety tests were done, the officers decided to detain Marquette and even attempted to have his car impounded. Marquette's brother Ronald Marquette was sitting in the passenger seat until he decided to go down the street to get the rest of their family. Their pregnant mother shows up and gets shoved, and this ignites a lot of anger. As people see the pregnant Rena Price get hit and shoved, crowds begin to form and even start throwing objects at the officers. The Fry brothers and their mother Rena Price were all arrested that day. The crowds begin to turn into mobs, and the officers end up losing control of the situation and call in the National Guard for assistance. Within 2 days, 16,000 law enforcement personnel were patrolling the city. The Watts neighborhood had become a war zone. Blockades were established and warning signs were posted throughout the riot areas, threatening to use deadly force if needed. Rioters tore up sidewalks and bricks to throw at law enforcement and to smash their vehicles. Arson and stealing were mostly focused on local white-owned stores and businesses that were said to have caused resentment in the neighborhood due to low wages and high prices for local workers. Laws for curfew times began to go into effect, and anyone in the Watts area that was out after 8 p.m. was arrested. Eventually, around 3,500 people are arrested, and by the morning of August 15th, the riots had begun to calm down. Over the course of 6 days, between 31,000 and 35,000 adults participated in the riots. An LA resident claims that she has lived in the city for 17 years and considers herself a responsible person, but she has never heard policemen talk like they did. She also has never seen anything like this happen there. William H. Parker, the Los Angeles police chief, says that people have lost all respect for the law, and an outgrowth of civil disobedience has been built up. Robert F. Williams, a black activist, states that Los Angeles is a warning to oppressor racist beasts that they can no longer enjoy immunity from retribution for their brutal crimes of violence and oppression of our people. The key persons who ultimately caused the Watts riots was Marquette Fry and the police officers, but the names of the Fry family involved in the initial riot were Marquette Fry, Ronald Fry, and Rena Price, their mother. Some of the key causes of the Watts riots has been identified as previous riots occurring throughout the country at that time period. Tension between African Americans and law enforcement, poor living conditions for African Americans, and even arrests. In an academic journal titled The LA Riots, a study in crisis paralysis, they found that the root cause of the Watts riots is despair and poverty. Some consequences of the Watts riots includes 34 dead African American citizens, 2 policemen and 1 firefighter were among the casualties, and 26 deaths, mostly the result of Los Angeles Police Department or National Guard. A new light of do-it-yourself activism began in Watts. Street gang members began to join the Black Panther Party to rebuild and monitor police activity. There are many claims that the Watts riots sparked other areas to begin to riot as well. And the textbook also claims that riots like the Watts riots taints white Americans' perception of the civil rights movement and urban life in general. The Watts riots is an important event because it highlights a real issue between law enforcement and how they treat the African American community, especially in areas like Los Angeles. In an article published by LA Times, they provide first-hand accounts of witnesses of the riots, and one witness named Over Lamar Bradley describes a scene where her and her husband are witnessing 10 cops beating one black man who is handcuffed, and when they tell the cops that he's handcuffed, they replied by saying "get out of here" and repeatedly calling them the N-word. This scene goes to show the amount of hatred there is between the cops and the people of Watts neighborhood. The Watts riots gave a lot of attention to a cause that really is an issue all around the world rather than just in California or the United States. Watts riots still affects LA to this day. In fact, a monograph study done by Mate, Adam et al., they found that Watts, California is LA's epicenter of fear, and that spatial cluster analysis provides evidence that this fear is most closely associated with the 1965 Watts riots. In an article published by History.com, they claim that a commission was set up to study the causes of the riot, after which several community improvement suggestions were made and that would improve schools, employment, housing, healthcare, and relations with the police department. The riots also sparked a civil rights movement against racial injustices that people will live by even to this day. Many people were killed and businesses were destroyed. For some that may not have been worth the deaths, time, or even the money, but to others it was more than that. It was a time to stand up against racial injustices that had been carried on for too long. The Watts riots was a 6-day long riot that represented the need for equality. I can only speak for myself when I say this story is inspiring and has impacted the way I view law enforcement brutality against the African American community.